Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. My name is Schaumloeffel. I'm lecturer at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Welcome back to the series Brazil 200 Years of Independence, History, Language and Culture. This week, I will present and I will talk about the Afro-Brazilian returnees to West Africa, especially the case of the Tabom people in Ghana. The presentation is part of a series of 3 workshops, presentations, and discussions presented by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Welcome back, everyone. So tonight, I will talk about a topic that is very close to my heart, actually, and let me explain why. Perhaps some of you already know that I lived from 2000 and let's see, so you perhaps know that I lived from 2003 to 2005 in Ghana in West Africa, and I was a lecturer there, teaching Portuguese at the University of Ghana. When I arrived there, this was an initiative also by the local Brazilian embassy. They wanted a lecturer to teach Portuguese in Ghana. The Brazilian ambassador told me, look, you will not just teach here. There are also some Ghanaians. They call themselves Brazilians, and you will teach them as well, and you will be responsible for some cultural activities in the embassy as well. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So when I heard about those Brazilians, I was completely ignorant about the topic, and I had no clue what the ambassador actually was talking about. Well, what he was talking about was about a group of returnees, of Afro-Brazilian returnees that went back to West Africa from the year more or less 1838 until 1850, 1855, okay? And I wanted to read more about this group of people that I had no idea about. And to my surprise, I found little, if virtually no information about them. But I learned that there were Afro-Brazilian returnees to Benin and Togo and to Nigeria. And it was Pierre Berger, a Frenchman that was a big Africanist and a Brazilianist that studied the Afro-Brazilians as well, that wrote about them, and a few other people. But there was nothing about the Afro-Brazilians that returned to Ghana. Actually, if you look here at the pictures on the right on this PowerPoint, you see what is called the Acervo Aguda. And Aguda is one of the names given to Afro-Brazilians that returned to West Africa, especially to Togo and Benin. And a friend of mine, a researcher, studied the Aguda people, and he has a website called Acervo Aguda, as you see there, and there are some illustrations there, okay? So it is estimated that about 3,000 to 8,000 Afro-Brazilians returned to West Africa. And now, obviously, you know, remember Dr. Rocha in previous sessions talked about the slavery system, slaves being brought to Brazil and so on. And now you will say, but why did some Afro-Brazilians return? There are basically 2 different reasons why Afro-Brazilians, meaning descendants of enslaved Africans, would return to West Africa. Obviously, this is still before the abolition of slavery, right? Which in Brazil was one of the last countries in the world. It happened only in 1888, so it was before slavery was actually abolished in Brazil. And those 3,000 to 8,000 Afro-Brazilians that decided to return to West Africa, as I said, there were 2 reasons for that. One of the reasons was they got their freedom and they decided freely to go back to their motherland. Let's not forget, there were about 6 million. Also, those are estimations because Brazil burned all the registers about the trafficking of slaves. Okay, so we don't know exactly, it's estimation. So there are estimates from 6 million to 12 million Africans that were enslaved and taken to Brazil. And only a handful compared to that amount decided to return to Africa, and especially to West Africa. So some of them, after they got their freedom, they could buy their freedom. There were several ways of becoming a free person in the slavery system in Brazil. They decided to go back. But the majority actually was expelled from Brazil. And expelled why? Again, I come back to the presentation a few weeks ago by Dr. Rocha. And remember, she mentioned the different revolts we had in Brazil before Brazil got independent and after Brazil got independent, before Brazil became a republic and so. And one of the revolts she mentioned was the Malay revolt. And remember, she said this Malay revolt took place in 1835 in Salvador da Bahia, and was basically organized by Muslims, by Africans that had Islamism as their main faith, and they used Arabic language to organize this revolt against their masters in Bahia, in Salvador. Okay, and after that revolt, it's by no chance that a lot of Muslims, African or Afro-Brazilians were expelled from Brazil and sent somewhere in Africa. And if you remember, if you look at the map, West Africa is the closest point to where Bahia is in Brazil. So it was the easiest way to send them there, the shortest way, actually, right? And most of them were actually expelled from Brazil and sent to West Africa. Well, the Afro-Brazilians in Benin and Togo, they are called Agudas, and in Nigeria, they're called Amaros. And they left behind heritage, culture, okay? So that's why you find places in Benin, Togo, and Nigeria called, for example, Brazil Social Club, or in Togo, there is a museum called Museu da Silva, or there is the Brazilian Mosque in Lagos. And this is very interesting. The Brazilian Mosque in Lagos was commissioned, and they asked the Afro-Brazilians to build them because they had several skills that were not necessarily available locally. And those Afro-Brazilians decided to build a mosque. And if you look at the mosque, and it's similar to the picture you have here, where it says architecture, it looks like a colonial Catholic church, a Catholic colonial Portuguese Catholic church in Lagos, Nigeria. It just has a minaret also attached to it, so it looks like a mosque. But the design of the church built by the Afro-Brazilians, that's what they knew, looked like a Catholic colonial church in Bahia. Or there are even public schools called Brazil, or there is Brazil Lane or Brazil Quarter. As I will show you also later, this also happens in Accra, the capital of Ghana. And also, they had an influence in language. So you find words in West Africa that are absolutely Portuguese, that are partially from the time the Portuguese were present in West Africa, but also taken from Brazil by the Afro-Brazilians to West Africa. So you find words like copo, which means glass, faca, which means knife, or in food, moqueca, which is a fish dish, or cozido. It even has like the French accent in Benin and Togo, cozido, but in fact it's pronounced cocido, which is a stew, and feijoada, the black bean stew, acará, and farofa. We mentioned that in the presentation that Sean Samad had about the food in Bahia earlier this month. No, it was already last month, I guess. Yes? Okay, and they also have cultural traditions like the Catholic part is of Nosso Senhor de Bonfim, which is the Senhor de Bonfim, and the Folguedo da Burinha, which is this here where they play, and this is back from the time in Portugal, where they have like or they simulate like a horse, a mock horse, and it's a festival, okay? And they have the same Folguedo da Burinha in Togo and Benin. They just call it Burian because it is already adapted to the French language there. And they left different influences. For example, the first democratically elected president of Togo was Sylvanus Olympio, which was a descendant of those Afro-Brazilians. And they had the famous and infamous Chacha, Francisco Felix de Souza. Francisco Felix de Souza was one of those guys that migrated freely to West Africa. And he is said to have been one of the richest men in the world at his time. Okay, he lived to the age of 94. He was Brazilian, and he died in 1849, as you can see here in Wikipedia. And it is also said that Francisco Felix de Souza, the so-called Chacha, he had, the numbers are down here. I'm not sure if I have them exactly in my head. So when he died, he was a merchant, he was a slave trader, okay, and he left 53 widows, over 80 sons. They don't know the amount of daughters, because daughters they didn't count in those days. And he had over 2,000 slaves by himself as well. So he was very rich, and he was one of those famous returnees to Benin and Togo. This is just as a general introduction on the Afro-Brazilian returnees to West Africa. Now, I would like to come specifically to the so-called Tabom people or Tabom community, okay? And what is interesting here is that the Tabom community, they were Afro-Brazilians that returned first, the majority of them, to Nigeria. And for some reason, they don't know today exactly anymore why, they were not so welcome, or they didn't like Nigeria and especially Lagos so much. So they decided to then go ahead and go to Accra in Ghana, where they were really welcomed by the ethnic group called Ga, the Ga that live around the area of Accra, the capital of Ghana, okay? So the first group arrived in 1836 on August the 8th, and it was a group of about 200 people that came directly from Brazil. That was the first from Brazil, but the first one to arrive really, that today make up the Tabong people, they arrived in 1829 already, the first ones, to Ghana. And now the name Tabong is very interesting because those Afro-Brazilians, when they returned, they could not speak any of the local languages. And just Ghana has, for example, 66 different languages that are spoken in Ghana, depending on your ethnic group and the area where you come from. You speak a different language, and they sometimes, or usually, they don't understand each other. And those Afro-Brazilians that went back, they could only speak Portuguese. And they could only speak Portuguese and Arabic, obviously, for the religious reasons, but none of the local languages. And this was also part of the tactics by the Portuguese when they enslaved Africans and took them to Brazil. They would mix them up so they could not communicate amongst each other. And, for example, organize a revolt or plot to try and kill the master or so. So they lost their roots, they lost their language, and they were obliged to learn Portuguese. And obviously the master would understand Portuguese. So it was also a tool of oppression and control that these persons lost their mother tongue when they arrived in Brazil, or had no use for it because they were mixed up. So they had to learn Portuguese. And obviously those Tabong, when they returned to West Africa, to Ghana specifically, they could only speak Portuguese. And they would not understand the locals. And they would always say what we say in Portuguese. When you say, it's okay, or it's fine, it's good, they would always say, yeah, tá bom, tá bom, tá bom, and they would not understand anything. And the Ga had no clue what they were saying when they were saying tá bom. Tá bom means it's good, it's fine. So the Ga people started to call them Tabong. And they said, those are the Tabong people because they say Tabong all the time. And that is where the community got its name from. They actually write Tabom in the English way, as you see here in the picture, actually the banner here with an M, okay? But the correct writing in Portuguese would be with an M, but that's not so important here for our purposes. And the Tabom always had a royal line, a so-called king, or as they call it, right? So, and the Nelson family was always the Tabom Manses. Manse is the word they use for their king or their leader, right? So the Manse was always from the Nelson family. And so we have a royal line, as you see here, of Niazuma the first, the second, Niaruna the first, Niazuma the third, the fourth, and currently Niazuma the fifth. As you see here, in this very old picture, you see Ni Alasha, his real name. He was the Brazilian João Antonio Nelson, and he later became Niazuma. This is one of the first pictures that Tabom have. Also, how did I collect all those historic data, pictures, and so on? I obviously was in very close touch to the Tabom. I always would see the Manche, the king of the Tabom, Niazuma V. I would meet the Tabom. I taught them Portuguese. I would go in and interview them. And when I saw that I had a lot of material about the Tabom and not much was known about them, I decided to write a book on them, okay? So I can show you later that book. And actually, what you see here then in the second picture is what they call the outdooring ceremony. The outdooring ceremony is when the new Manche or the new king is presented to the public. So it's brought outdoors, right? And this was in 1988 when the new Tabom Manche was outdoors, so to say, although he was already chosen a bit earlier. Okay, so there we go. So the Tabom, why were they welcomed by the Ga people of Ghana? The Ga people welcomed them because they had a lot of skills and they were open because the area where the Ga lived was the Usherford and Jamestown area in Accra. And it was a port area. So they had always contact with the so-called outside world, okay? So the first Tabom, they were traders. And according to the records from 1845 to 1864, records kept by the Danish castle of Christianborg. That castle is what today is Osu Castle, which is the government palace today in Ghana. They also registered that Afro-Brazilians were active in slave trading. So they became traders not only of goods, but also of people. So the same people that before were enslaved in Brazil after they got their freedom or they were expelled, they also engaged in the same trading of sending and selling humans to the New World, okay? And the Tabom, they were in the so-called Otoblohom division, and they got land there. So those were prime areas that they got. And the areas were of Jamestown, of Usherford, and Adabraka, which I can show you soon on the map. And the Tabom were also welcomed because they started plantations. As you see here in this plan, the division of the lands, and they started irrigation systems, and they were instrumental in improving the health conditions. They started to dig very deep wells to get fresh water because you had a lot of diseases in those days because of poor quality water. And they brought this habit, so to say, and this facility of having better quality water to the local people. And that's why they, up to today, they are welcomed by the Ga people. And as you see, what is interesting here is the division, the plan. It is all called the property of Chief John Nelson. So it all belongs to the chief that allocates it to the members of the community. And it is simply described as situation of Brazilian land. So they call it Brazilian land, although it's in Ghana, in West Africa. And these people, they are called Brazilians. If you look here, we have a place, I will come back to that later, it's called Brazil House, okay? I will tell you the story of Brazil House later, this place here. But this is the map, and this was the area in Accra, Ghana, where the previous port was. Today the port is in Tema, which is a bit further away from Accra, outside the capital. So they got prime land here in this area here, okay, of the capital, which today is like the prime area, the better area of the capital. So as I said, the port is in Tema. Tema is here next to it, and next to it is already Togo, Lomé, the capital, and Porto Novo, Benin, and Lagos, Nigeria, not so far away. That is where the Afro-Brazilians decided to settle down. So as I told you here, from Bahia to there, this is about the closest you can get from Africa if you are in the northeast of Brazil, West Africa, okay? So, as I mentioned, the Tabom, they had several skills, and one of the skills they had, they were good in producing clothing. So they were so good in producing pieces of clothing that they founded a place called the First Scissors House. And this was the first scissors house here in the picture that you see that I visited when it was in a very bad state of disrepair. But in here, you had sizzling activities still up to today, or up to recently, I should rather say, in tailoring. So the Tabon had very good tailors, and they also provided the tailors and the uniforms for the Ghana army, for example, okay? And there are famous tailors in town, and most of them are descendants of the Tabon. One of them, I recall, is Dan Martin, and everyone that wanted a very nice suit in town would go and see Dan Martin, okay? And the First Scissors House was run by this guy that is already, unfortunately, dead today, but he was 94 when I was there, and it was Niaruna Nelson, also a Nelson. And you see here, if you look carefully at the picture, you see Niaruna Nelson, read the Tabon, First Scissors House, and they mentioned the ship Salisbury. I cannot read it there from the picture, it's not so clear, but they say ship 1854. So they celebrate their immigration from Brazil to Ghana. And as I said here, point 11, they helped to improve the sanitary conditions, right? And they also had skills in architecture and construction. So the first arcades and the Brazilian Baroque style present in Accra in Ghana was brought by the Tabon. Let me show you now some pictures from my book, pages 50 to 60, should be open around here. And you would also see, like from their style, you see that they were masters in tailoring, and so they had those skills. And as you see here, so those are the Ga people from the Ga community, and this was the Brazilian there. You see, even dressed completely different at the beginning, more like a Westerner or in Western style. This picture here shows you the activity that was going on in the First Scissors House. Also, some people that run the First Scissors House. But unfortunately, the second time I went to Ghana for the inauguration of the Brazil House that I will talk about later, just a month later, I arrived there. The First Scissors House caught fire, burned down, and what was this here, the picture on the right, looked like this here. Now the picture on the right, unfortunately. Okay. So, as I said, the Tabon, you can also interrupt me anytime. Okay, feel free to ask me questions if you didn't understand something, or if you would like to understand something better, or if there is any curiosity. You can also interrupt me. I will not see your hands raised, but you can just activate your microphone and ask questions, okay? So as I said, the Tabon, they are fully today integrated into the Ga branch. And this was one day the Manche Niazuma Nelson, he wanted me and the Brazilian ambassador to see the whole GA branch, the whole GA division in Accra at their headquarters. And he said, we have to go there and we have to show you all these people. And he was very proud in having us over as guests. So you see the GA people there, and you see at the center is the then Brazilian ambassador called Paulo Wolowski. The Tabom Manche, or he is here. Okay, so this was a visit we paid one day to see the GA people. Now, when we come to certain cultural aspects, one of the interesting cultural aspects is religion. Actually, because those Tabong people, they were involved in organizing the Malay revolt, they were also responsible for consolidating Islamism on the coast of Ghana, because the coast of Ghana had no Islamism. Islamism was further up, closer to the Sahel region, to the Sahara Desert, but not on the coast. And they helped to implant, actually, and consolidate Islam on the coast of Ghana when they arrived there. But today, they are mainly Protestants, they are Anglicans, they are Presbyterians, they are Methodists. The Tabong Manche himself, he is, for example, Anglican, okay? But I also mentioned, because, and we will come to this topic on another session, the Afro-Brazilian religions that have a heavy influence of the deities from West Africa. And I mentioned this to them, and they said, first, that they don't have such a thing. They are all Anglicans, they are Presbyterians, they are Methodists, and so. But when I insisted with them and said, but don't you have even any relics, something from what the Africans would worship in Brazil? Is there nothing left? And they said no. But after some time, the Tabong chief, he decided, he was a bit reluctant, but he said, look, I have something to tell you. We keep this more or less as a secret, but yes, we have something that is from Brazil and is related to Afro-Brazilian religion. He said, oh, really, what is that? So they made a big mystery. It took a while. It took like 2 or 3 months until they then decided that I was suitable to go and see their place of worshiping, their temple, as we call it, terreiro in Brazil, which is, terreiro is more or less backyard or something like that. But it's also called the worshiping place, like the temple for Afro-Brazilian religions. And to my surprise, when I arrived there, they had a ceremony, the pouring libation, where they offer gin to the gods, and they pour some on the floor. So this is for the ancestors and it's for the gods, offering it to them, so that the libation ceremony. And they took me to a place where they had a Shango, and Shango is one of the deities of of the many deities in Afro-Brazilian religion. Okay, so if we go to Shango, you can read this up later if you're interested in that. In English, it's called Shango. So you can read a bit more about the deity or divinity, or the Orisha, as it is also called, Shango. Okay, and the family that kept that secret, so to say, was the Kwarkupumi family. I knew the Kwarkupumi family, and I never mentioned anything to me in that regard, and up to that day. And they also they presented to me, they had a full calendar of the days of celebration of Shango that went all the way from 1900 to 2619. So they have all that scheduled already, the days they would celebrate Shango. And they also had the typical Oshe, which is the hatchet, the 2-blade hatchet, which is also one of the symbols of Shango. And even the biggest surprise to me was that in the breaks, while we had our conversations and while they were having their performance of the rituals, the ladies there, also accompanied by some men, they start to clap their hands and they sang songs of Shango, typical songs of Shango, and even a bigger surprise was that they were not in their local language, but it was in Yoruba language. And why Yoruba language? Because Yoruba language in Brazil, or Yoruba languages from Nigeria, is instrumental in those Afro-Brazilian uh, rituals in the religion. Okay, so they brought back from Brazil Yoruba language, perhaps also some influence from the time some of them spent in Nigeria. They don't know about that. And some of the songs they sing, they would not even understand, but it is Yoruba, and they would just sing it because that's the way they learned them. Okay. So some people do not even understand what it means, but they know it's like praising God and pleasing God. So yeah, so that is something they have left. That is kind of a little bit of a secret, but they still have those rituals. Uh, there are also some personalities, famous people, Tabom people, and perhaps the one people know the best is the boxer you see on the right, which was Azuma Nelson. He was a famous boxer at some time, sometimes also called just Zoom Zoom. And don't forget, the Tabong chief is also called Ni Azuma the Fifth. So Azuma Nelson was a boxer from Ghana, and he was a famous personality. But you'd also get different people that were famous, like Francisco Ribeiro. He asked the English government to build schools for them because he saw the importance of education. And there was Zaqueu Peregrino, and he allowed his slaves to learn the Quran. And you had the Anglican Bishop George Nelson. There was a politician called Samuel Azuma. He was a minister at some time, if I'm not wrong, and Kangang da Costa, who was Deputy Minister of Defense in 1977, Aruna Morton, he was a doctor, and Francisco Ribeiro was a famous lawyer, and his son, Tom Ribeiro, he was a director who assisted in the movie, the famous Cobra Verde, or Green Snake of the German Werner Herzog, that also had Klaus Kinski in it. Younger people probably won't know about that, but older people will remember that. So Tom Ribeiro is famous in cinema. And you also had the leader of the first Scissors House, George Aruna Nelson, the one you saw in the picture earlier. So George Aruna Nelson is this guy here. And you also had Professor Fishin, who was a professor at the University of Ghana. Professor Fishin is the one on the bottom right. And you had Chief Justice of Ghana, Georgina Wood, who was also in the government of the President John Kufuor. So Georgina Wood is well known in Ghana as well. Now, there is a place in the map I showed you called Brazil House, right? And if I go back to it, do I have it still open here? Let me see. No, but anyway, map, Ghana, Brazil House. Hopefully we'll find it that way. Where is Google Maps? Anyway, should be here. Open this. So Brazil House is here in the area where the Tabong arrived, okay? And Brazil House was one of the first houses where Tabong settled down when they arrived before they got their lands, okay? And this place, because it was the first place where they arrived, it became kind of a symbol. And then there was an initiative of private companies, the Brazilian embassy. I also supported that idea of renewing and rehabilitating the house that the Tabong anyway called Brazil House before, but was not in such a good state, to become like a cultural center for the Tabong. And with the support of the Brazilian government and private companies, this place was rehabilitated, and it became the cultural center that was inaugurated in 2007. I was already here in Barbados in 2007 for 2 years, but I was glad Tabom and the Brazilian embassy at the time, they invited me to be present at the inauguration. It was very, very special occasion for Tabom, because now they finally had a place that was their hub, their cultural center, where they could come together and celebrate their culture, their ancestors, and their community. Okay, so this was the inauguration of the Brazil House, and today Brazil House is multi-purpose. It is a place where people can learn the Brazilian language, can learn about the Tabom culture, can learn about the Brazilian culture. They have and had dance classes, music classes in the Tabom House. So everything around culture, language, and their history happens in Brazil House today, even if the majority of the Tabom do not live in that area. They are today all spread all over the capital and even outside of the capital, Accra. Okay, the Tabom, they also have a few symbols, and they have a flag, and the flag reads Ololokolo, and they didn't know what Ololokolo meant when I asked them. And people, when somebody shouts Ololokolo, somebody will reply, or the people will sing and reply, Amogidiapo, Amogidiapo. I had students that spoke Yoruba, and I had Nigerian students, and I asked them if they perhaps would understand this. And they said, of course, this is a Yoruba influence, and we understand it. And on their flag, Tabom, there is written Ololokolu, and Ololokolu means the king has arrived. The king has arrived. So it's basically the greeting for when the chief, the Tabom chief, arrives, and then the crowd replies Amogidiapo, which means the strong will listen. Okay, and that is what the Tabom flag says. And they have, like, as you see, the entourage. They have a flag bearer. There is a whole system in their chieftaincy system, not only by the Tabom, but by all the people or the peoples in Ghana. They have the chieftaincy system, and they have rituals that are well known, and different hierarchies, and all that. Lastly, what is also interesting is that they have a very strong identity. Although today they don't speak Portuguese anymore, they have some words left from Portuguese, but they have a very strong identity, and they call themselves the Brazilians. So they say, we are the Brazilians. And I asked them, especially the chief, so do you really feel Brazilian, not speaking the language and being like the sixth or so generation in Ghana and being completely integrated into the Ga? He said, yes, because we are different from them. We dress differently. Sometimes we have different ways of being, and they consider us the Brazilians, and we consider ourselves the Brazilians. And that is completely fine. So if they feel like that, that's their identity. They had the big wish of going to Brazil, know Brazil. A few Tabom had a chance to go to Brazil and see Bahia, the place where their ancestors come from. And the Tabom chief that you see here in the picture in the center, he always told me, but I want to know the Brazilian president. And I want to meet the Brazilian president and tell them about us. And it really happened that in 2003, the then Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, went to Ghana. And one of the first things Lula da Silva did was seeing the Tabom. And they had a big ceremony. And this actually is a picture I took on the day of that ceremony, which was in the backyard of the residence of the Brazilian ambassador. And it was a huge Tabom party to celebrate the presence of President Lula da Silva. And they said, our president is now in Ghana. That's what they would say. And actually, later, Lula da Silva returned a second time to Ghana, and also 2 years later, and also went again to see the Tabom. Okay. Now here you can see Those pictures are from the days I was a bit older than I am today. But you see on the top left the picture of the first Portuguese class I taught the Tabom. Perhaps you can identify here, this is the Tabom king. So all those people, they came up to learn Portuguese, and I had a whiteboard there, and I'm standing next to the Tabom chief there. We also had different occasions, like on the top right, I would sometimes go with some representative from the Brazilian embassy and take some materials for the Tabom about Brazil and about Brazilian culture and so, and they would always be pleased to welcome us. And here on the bottom left is the picture when the Tabom chief greets President Lula da Silva in 2003. And what you see there is you can see how happy he is in his face. And introducing him is President John Kufuor, the president of Ghana at the time, accompanied by Lula da Silva. And on the top, on the bottom right, it's me having a chat with Nia Zuma Nelson, dressed completely different from my usual way of dressing, because it was this special occasion of the visit of the president, and we were just chatting about the occasion, and you can see how happy he was about all that. Okay, so now as last thing, I have a video here with some pictures playing. I would like to play those, but also just a second, let me get things organized here. I'm playing those pictures. Let me put this a bit more further up so I can see. So that's it from my presentation today about the Tabom. But I would like now to open the floor and hear from you. Do you have any questions? Would you like to comment something about this presentation on the Tabom? I have to say, actually, since we are discussing and we discussed like cultural aspects of everything, it was a fascinating time for me because I learned a lot of things about the Tabom, and not only about the Tabom, also for living abroad, living in Ghana. I didn't know any English. I learned English there. I never had English classes in my life, and that's where I learned English. So everything was fascinating. It was culturally very nice, and I had a very good time with the Tabom in Ghana. There were difficulties in those days, as there probably still are some today, regarding infrastructure and so, but it was, after all, a very good time. Let me hear the restricted like that. Good. And there we go. Okay, so I see Len already has a question. Yes, go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
What was the music like? The music of the Tabom? Was it a mixture of Brazilian type rhythms, Afro-Brazilian rhythms? Did you recognize any of the nuances of the Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian music, or was it completely Ga? I know that the music is really a marriage between the two, and it went back and forth from Africa to Brazil and then back. But I just want to know if you heard any specific phrases or accents of Brazil. Thank you.
Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm not sure if I will find this right now. Yes. There is a person that did a whole study about music, okay? But as you can see here, this is the article by Juan Diego Diaz and Capoeira's Return to Africa, Updating Brazilianness Amongst the Tabom in Ghana. And he studied some of those aspects, okay? But basically, they are very Ga today, but they still have some little Brazilian influences, but especially also influences from religious rituals, okay, which is a different kind of drumming a little bit is different, but also some little nuances of samba, I would say, although I'm not a music specialist, but it's slightly different from the Ga, but still very Ga today, okay? So I would recommend you to read this article if you're interested. It explains a lot of things, okay? Capoeira's return to Africa, updating Brazilianness amongst Tabom in Ghana. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Yes, Charlotte?
Hi, good night again. So a follow-up to the other question just posed, are there any similarities in the culture otherwise, like in terms of the culinary aspects, especially?
Yes, they have a lot of influences in their way of cooking from Bahia, Brazil, obviously, right? So they have this dishes, but again, this is a bit difficult to separate, yeah, because we have influences from West Africa in Brazil. So now, how are you going to determine what is typically Brazilian if it is also West African in first place, right? So the influences they have in terms of food are partially influenced by Bahia, Brazil, but then at the same time, like the eating of akara, as they say, but this is also present in Ghana. So now, but in turn, where does the Bahia way of eating come from? It comes from West Africa. So is it now a direct influence? Is it an indirect influence? What is it? So it's hard to determine because it sometimes is very similar. Yeah, so, and the use of palm oil, for example, is very common as well. Almost every dish in Bahia has palm oil. So yeah, it's very hard to say, but there definitely are Bahian influences, perhaps a bit more like this thing of eating dried shrimp, perhaps, which is so typical. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions? I forgot to say at the beginning, I actually promised you, yes, Charlotte, you'll be soon, but let me just say something. I told you last week that we probably would have a presentation today on Amerindian languages of Brazil. That presentation didn't happen because the person had some private issues regarding health and so, but we will have it soon. So that, it was canceled, and I just jumped in at last minute to do this presentation. Okay, so what I promised last week will take place in the future. Hopefully, it is scheduled, and we will see. Okay, so that is why. If you found it strange that this presentation came up when I promised something else last week, that is the reason. Okay. Yes, Charlotte, you want to ask something else?
Yes. Have the Tabom people been able to somehow trace who their relations were back in Brazil?
Yes, they went back to Brazil, some of them, and they saw that the majority of them they didn't have any ancestors back in Brazil because their whole families left for West Africa. Okay. At the same time, some of them would be able to trace it back, but it's all very difficult because there was a whole culture in those days, and especially regarding slaves in Brazil, that things would not be registered. And whatever was registered, there was a guy called Rui Barbosa in Brazil, he decided to burn all the archives with the excuse that we should get rid of this horrible past of slavery. But that was exactly the wrong step. And the reason for doing that was actually not to get rid of the past of the slavery system, but it was get rid of the proofs that you could have later incriminating masters. Okay, so all what they had was burned, the archives, and so it's very difficult to trace it back. And also because the same reason is those Afro-Brazilians, they don't know where they came from. Was it from areas that the Portuguese brought slaves from, like in the south of Africa, Angola, Mozambique? Was it from West Africa? From where was it? Because they all got mixed up, right? And they lost their roots. So tracing back those roots are difficult. Perhaps the easiest way would be DNA, right? So yeah, but I definitely found some roots, and the roots are in Salvador, Bahia. Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions? Other comments? If not, so that's it for today. Foreseen for next week is a conversation with a British guy, a former university lecturer that lived almost all his life in the UK, if I'm not wrong. Also spent some time in Ghana, I know that, and is married to a Brazilian. And right now he is in Brazil. And if I'm not wrong, living in Brazil. And he will talk about his experience on Brazil, the cultural aspects that he finds interesting, and the things he had a hard time with. Basically, his experience as a foreigner living with a Brazilian, and also how he experiences Brazil whenever he goes and visits Brazil, or when he lives there for a while. Okay, so that will be the topic next week if all remains the same. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for being here. I wish you all good night, and I say ciao, bye bye. See you next week.
Okay, good night. See you next week.
Good night.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Ciao.
Tchau, tchau.
Ciao, ciao. Boa noite.